Out in the unknown, uninhabited reaches, a group of isolated explorers began a staggering journey. One marked with endurance, perseverance, and discovery, backed by, at that point, the height of NASA. Now, you would be forgiven for thinking of the more famous group, one which did end on a watery return to Earth. But the group I'm talking about was that of the PX-15, the Benjamin Franklin, which on its journey traveled in essence the entire Atlantic length of the US. Its journey tested its crew in both duration and isolation, for the results and for the effects of the journey on its occupants. The currents and the flow of the Gulf Stream were also measured with its 6-man crew. Perhaps coincidentally, it was also the brainchild of an explorer whose last name is Picard. The journey of the PX-15 really embodies a good amount of the character of the machines that this first half of videos will focus on. Eternally overshadowed by flashier and louder vehicles, by jet planes and battleships, an entity with whom much DNA would be given to the spacecraft, and the spirit of what they would both be and look like. If one could argue that only planes own the sky, and that we, walking around, merely occupy its lowest floor, then one could also argue that, while we have sailed the waves for thousands of years, this machine is the first and only to truly be of the waters. Well, the submarine, as a machine, was in its formative real-life adolescence, with early crude designs beginning to use the technology of the Industrial Revolution to grapple with the challenge of just existing below the waves. The best place to start, perhaps, would be with Jules Verne. If War of the Worlds is an archetypal work for the idea of the land-striding Mecca, Jules Verne's books truly mark a pivotal fictional anchor point to start our journey with. Many of its influences still very much mark some of the most famous ideas associated with that machine, which is the submarine. Mechanically, it is this terrifying force, an entity which flies through the ocean, rising from the depths, in that fear-inducing method that perhaps we, and all other terrestrial animals, retain, that fear of something coming out of the deep blue space, which always exists beneath our kicking feet or the hulls of our boats, that negative sky stretching all the way down. But beyond just that, Jules Verne's books establish the start of the character of the submarine, those who are on board it being different, special. In the case of 20,000 Leagues, it's that of Captain Nemo. It's of a kind of isolation. In a way, it's quite simple. The submarine, the machine itself as we know it, it has to be independent, self-sustaining, not linked to the air of the surface or the comfort and sunlight of the wide open spaces we mentally enjoy and think of as normal. It has to restrain huge pressure, travel through darkness, survive in an oxygenless world. And so, if this is the machine, then how does that impact its character? The answer is ironically a sense of freedom. The freedom to strike back at society and at normality. That is the idea of Captain Nemo in a way. Another of Verne's early works would also show many of the ideas that would go on to embody the character of the submarine. For the Flag is a story in which the use of new destructive weapons, including the Fulgurator, a weapon capable of subjugating the whole Earth, which should sound eerily familiar to us now, and of course the submarine itself. There is pitched submarine battles, and of attacks on shipping and innocent passenger lines by submersible-equipped pirates. Perhaps the most visually breathtaking and interesting adaptation of this early period, and these works, is the Czechoslovakian Karel Zeman's Vynález Zkázy, or Invention for Destruction. Released in 1958, it is a film made in combination of several of Verne's stories, but which, in using a purposefully lithographic and illustrative style, you could easily be convinced was made at the same time as Méliès's 1902 film. It fully communicates the sense of Victorian wonder and the very idea of the submarine vehicle, with a wonderful visual approach and use of combined special practical effects, such as stop motion and compositing. Only a few years later, in 1963, Toho Pictures, famous for the likes of Godzilla and kaiju films, would make Atragon, or in its original Japanese title, Kaite Gunkan. Perhaps a very fantastical example maybe, as should be readily apparent by the massive dam drill in its front, it's still a very fun and wondrous example of, well, the submarine. It also flies, and it does a lot of crazy stuff. As well, I'm entirely certain that the whole drill rocket submarine idea just coincidentally coincided with the Russians developing a rocket torpedo, and it's not inspired, it's just a coincidence. The West also, of course, had the likes of Jerry Anderson's series Stingray, which also rode this high of 60 submarine stories, with some really fun practical effects and use of miniatures. It's quite impressive. It also starts with a massive explosion at sea and the claim that anything could happen in the next half hour, which I mean, mad respect, really. On a far more serious note, and far more realistic one, both in the realm of practical effects and of submarines, there's the movie that there's no way I could not mention, Das Boot. Das Boot's story is probably the most brutally real I will mention. It's an unwavering, unforgiving war film. It uses the isolation and endurance of the submarine as a machine, but also, for the submariner, as a direct purveyor of the intensity of war. You very much feel the growing grime, sweat, beards, and determination of this crew. It seems almost downright ironic that while many other war movies have a much bigger scope, cover more terrain, show more locations and action, or just generally have a bigger amount of stuff, Das Boot, despite mainly taking place on a machine even smaller than your average high school, channels its expression and atmosphere of war so much the stronger. It's a beautiful film exactly because it strips away all the grandiose typical war movie ideas and aspects that you kind of expect. It's just you, the crew, and the confines of the ship, and it is exactly enhanced by that very spirit of the U-boat, which, while perhaps some may describe as claustrophobic, I see it as an incredibly dense machine. Why? Because, returning to that previous idea, freedom, people focus on the limited hallways, tight compartments, and narrow ceilings, but if you remember just how far and how deep these machines can venture, you can see past the metal hull and feel the vast submerged world they can pass through. Now, as these early machines, like the U-boat, were inevitably quite limited, these ships were basically diesel torpedo attack boats, still limited to slow submerged periods, still extremely vulnerable and specific in use. A potent threat, but only an echo of what they would soon become, the shift that revolutionized the idea of the submarine into a space-age machine. And if you know who this is, you know what I'm going to talk about next. The incorporation of nuclear fission reactors into submarines was massive in the effect it would have. This is not truly like the shift from, say, the age of sail to the age of steam. It's more like the shift from the propeller to the jet turbine engine in jets. With nuclear reactors, the limits of the ocean vanished. Now, endurance meant nothing. There was no refueling. The already self-contained world aboard, making its own air, making its own water, was only in the end limited by the total amount of food it could store for its crew. With the launch of the Nautilus, the first nuclear US submarine, the road to the 6-month duration deployment had opened. The subsequent advancements made by not just the US, but USSR as well as many others, would see incredible feats accomplished. Ironically, it was that space relationship that submarines would draw back to that would provide the other half of the potent atomic aspect of the submarine, the intercontinental ballistic missile. With that, the idea of the military nuclear submarine, for better or worse, had been galvanized. Now, the thing with nuclear submarines is they are inherently tense and patient machines. This is why I personally admire them so much. The real strongest offense and defense of submarines is not the torpedo, it's not the missile, it's information. In the depths of the ocean, it is the slow and methodical gathering of information that makes up the average duty. Through the quiet, gradual, passive learning, listening for the sounds of the sea, and then analyzing that information. This is one of the things I adore so much, like the Leviathan-like huge eyes of the giant squid, or the sonar of the massive whale. The hunt in the deep ocean is one of patient information gathering. In this, the US was, still, and more or less is, unchallenged. While the Soviets focused on more dramatic doctrines, the US boats, like the Los Angeles class and subsequent Seawolf and Virginia, would instead focus on stealthy, quiet hunts. sneaking into the Arctic launch bastions of the nuclear Soviet ballistic missile submarines, or in silently prowling off the coasts of a dozen different nations on many different continents. While never in active war, the battle of information raged fiercely, and in truth still does. The knowledge of submarines is heavily classified, as everything from its propeller design, its machine noises, and so on can be used to track and to hunt these things. One piece of media, which I think is an amazing piece of art, which I think also sublimely tapped into this, even if it was just as a side element of its plot, is Metal Gear Solid 2. You see, the concept of mecha, of Metal Gear, have always, in a way, ironically shared much DNA with that of the submarine. In the purest sense, the role of many of the Metal Gears was to not really be a walking tank and fight in conventional war, it was to be an SSBN, a nuclear missile submarine, but for land, hiding deep in jungles and steppes and deserts with its payload. MGS-1's Metal Gear Rex was in a way a culmination of this. A railgun-equipped Metal Gear that could hit targets anywhere in the world with its nuke. But then, in 2, we see something else. Because, well, Metal Gear Solid 2 is no longer about the nuclear age, really. It's about the information age. We initially see the aquatic Metal Gear Ray, but much like the initial part of the game, it's entirely not the focus. It's a decoy machine. Just as the protagonist is not really Snake, but Raiden, the true pivotal machine is not Metal Gear Ray, but rather Arsenal Gear. Built under the very aquatic setting of Big Shell, Arsenal Gear is a massive 610 meter long and almost 400 meter wide submarine. While never even truly pictured in-game, its massive scale and size is initially rumored to house thousands of missiles. It has a whole hangar full of Metal Gears you pass through, and it is threatened to hold an extremely refined, very powerful hydrogen bomb. But once again, that's not really the point. Those weapons are all either fake or just icing on the cake. The real use of Arsenal Gear is to house GW, an AI that would gain control over all the information sources in the world, and which also ironically meant George Washington, which is just a complete coincidence with the Benjamin Franklin thing I mentioned earlier. Now, this does seem a bit much at first. After all, these weapons are the point, right? That's what these machines do, they fight. What was Kojima trying to say with this massive submarine? What was really the point? And the idea really was genius, if perhaps Kojima's heavy writing style did not convey it very well. In the age of the SSBN, its nuclear missile payload created a context of existence. People and society existed under the potential atomic war it carried inside it. It was always present. But after the fall of the Berlin Wall, in this age of the internet and of information, which, by the way, we are still living in the middle of, what now? This is the genius of Arsenal Gear and its idea. Arsenal Gear's artificial intelligence would create context in this world of information, not with the threat of atomic weapons, but through direct control of that information and society itself. It would be a new kind of submarine, an SSIN, a nuclear-powered information control submarine, able to shape society globally from the shadows of both the oceans of information and water. Now, while information, stealth, and precision was all still the doctrine of the US submarines across the Cold War and into modern times, the Soviet approach was something completely wild. Whereas Americans preferred passive sonar, that is, just listening to the ocean, if the Soviets went loud with their active sonar, that meant creating a sonar ping and reading the results, they were quite fearsome. They could fire more torpedoes, averaging 8 tubes to the American 6. They could go faster, hitting speeds of over 40 knots with some of their Papa and Alpha class boats. They could also go deeper, with some like the Mike class being able to dive to 1,500 meters, quite deep and well below the Los Angeles class with its likely 600 meter depth. They were aggressive, and once again, they mass-produced a frickin' rocket torpedo. But this came at a cost. Russian doctrine was, and always has been, more fast and loose with safety. But submarines are unforgiving machines, and the environment they dwell in is likewise unforgiving. The American Thresher and Scorpion disasters took their toll, but America largely learned its lessons from those incidents. Russia, during its rushed catch-up, had K-19, the Widowmaker, and especially during the decline and fall of the Soviet Union, with its budget drawbacks, it had the Mike class, and of course, most tragically, the Kursk. Death at sea can already be quite unpleasant, but aboard submarines, the death is either a sudden dramatic one, or even worse, a long, pained fate. A faulty torpedo in the Kursk detonated, rupturing and likely killing most of those in the front half of the ship. But it was the fate of those in the rear which was drawn out. The long, slow flooding, asphyxiation, loss of power. The truth is that a submarine, very much like a spaceship, is an isolated bubble of habitability. It's an oasis, an island in the depths for humans to live within. And when the submarine fails, when that bubble slowly drains, gradually disappears and is replaced by the natural crushing pressure, drowning waters, and black darkness of the sea, with it is taken the lives of the submariners as well. And this, sadly, still happens. Nadia, which initially began as an adaptation of 20,000 Leagues before changing dramatically during its production under Gainax, features at its focus a submarine, also likewise called the Nautilus, whose revenged focus captain is indeed also called Nemo. In its 15th episode, it features such a tragic situation. The damaged Nautilus must remain underwater for the surface fleet hunting it to hopefully leave. The blows it took from the other submarines in that fleet have taken their toll. The Nautilus is wounded and must remain on the bottom. The main character, Jean, must endure the fact his fellow friend and sailor is now trapped on the other side of a sealed-off bulkhead, trapped in the damaged engine compartment and doomed to die. Of course, the same tension and same setup should sound somewhat familiar, in that same relationship between the submarine and the spacecraft holding very true, it is indeed the same fate of the Vulcan Spock. Spock, who sacrifices himself to fix the damaged engine of the Enterprise, but in doing so perishes. And you might, if you have not realized it yet, that indeed all of The Wrath of Khan is more or less a submarine movie, but with the imagery of spaceships. Sure, they might technically fire quantum torpedoes and phasers, but in essence this movie is operating on a submarine style of logic. This is something that Star Trek will indeed often use. The final battle in the nebula even more or less takes place in an analogy for underwater, limited sensor range where the ships must approach each other very closely, and dramatic blows are delivered by torpedo and phaser. Now, if you think this is new, oh no! Interestingly enough, the antagonist Khan is in this case our vengeful captain, striking back at Kirk, but the comparison goes further back to the episode Space Seed where he first appeared. The very ship Khan and his followers show up in is basically inspired by that design. It has a very skipjack-class sail styled right into it, and really there is many more parallels between space and science fiction, and ships, and specifically submarines. You can in essence tell almost identical stories with just that same limited number of sets, a careful use of special effects, a bridge, an engine room, etc. If you want further proof of overlap, Defiant was designed by a man named Jim Martin, who had also designed the Atlantis Lost Empire's Ulysses submarine. This mechanical link between spacecraft and submersible is a very powerful one, both being mechanisms that need to keep out the hazards of the outside world. And perhaps one of the strangest and most ironic stories is that of space battleship Yamato. This very iconic series is probably one of the true pillars that define Japanese science fiction, mecha, and anime. But interestingly enough, the origins of its design lie perhaps squarely in something far more submerged. Now here I do have to give a big hand to Tim Eldred for doing the great work in figuring this all out and writing up the post that explained it. You see, the original design of the main ship that was to become the Yamato was actually an asteroid. The idea was for a generation ship to be launched into space. As time went on, the rough design was essentially just that, of a rock, with at most the very iconic pagoda of the IGN Nagato battleship poking out. However, when it became readily obvious the asteroid aspect would be dropped, and the shift to a battleship would be the focal point, it came time for the creators working on it to find somebody who could espouse that design visually. And of course, it naturally changed to the Yamato. The one that they initially chose was the original mangaka of Blue Sub No. 6. Satoru Ozawa. Blue Sub No. 6 specifically had the Yamato Wonder, a submarine rebuilt from the sunken Yamato itself, which, yes, should sound very familiar to Space Battleship Yamato fans. And it specifically had the iconography of an ascending ship upwards, which caught the eye of the Yamato creators. It is then somewhat ironic that while Ozawa did not come on board for Yamato's production, and instead the now very well-known inclusion of Leiji Matsumoto would in essence take the rough concept and run with it, the series eventually get its dimensional submarine and its complementary Not Nemo Captain. The series as well would pull from Ozawa's initial concepts for a kind of space battleship, which Leiji Matsumoto would then work into the more finalized iconic design. This would be very pivotal for the record of anime because the level of mechanical detail was attempted to be kept even during standard animation. Now, what this does also highlight through a very rather ironic series of events is that something that lies at the crux of both Submarine's but also Yamato's design. The fact that, while in design, the creators could not agree for the Yamato to have an imperial crest. It's that tension of identity. Should it, and by extension, should submarines be the symbol of war, a symbol of destruction, or one of ingenuity and space-age exploration of the unknown, of the fathoms, for humankind? These machines hold payloads that could very well end all surface civilization, while ironically being the only true vessels to pass under the waves into that isolated region. Perhaps it's best to end then on that tension. Humans pollute the oceans more and more, fish more and more, and yet, as much as we affect that space, only the submariners and the submarines really pass into that world. I grew up very much on stories and films of Jacques Cousteau and his children, of their exploration and care for that world and for the oceans, for the beauty and magnificence of the world under the filtered rays of sun. Through the submarine, we have seen what it looks like. The things that seem to be wastelands like the Arctic truly are home to vast, beautiful amounts of life. We have seen that even in the darkest depths, we have found strange but still earthly examples of living things. But we've also seen the reefs fade and slowly begin to die. We have changed the temperature and acidity of the oceans. We have hunted entire species to either near extinction or outright extinction. It is in the oceans where life came from, and were it not for the ocean, our very civilization would not exist. Yet at the same time, we take so much from it, and what we give back is so small and hard-fought in comparison. This is, as much as I love my submarine battles, love my revenge-minded submarine captains, and love the elegant hanging masses of the submarines themselves, really probably one of the core tensions, the core axis on which these machines exist. It is through the submariner, through the aquanaut, through the submarine and its cameras and its sonar, that we are made aware of this beauty, of the oceans as it both exists and we sadly also encroach on and destroy it. I hope you enjoyed this first section. Next time we will specifically be looking at the 1998 through 2000 OVA from Studio Gonzo, Blue Submarine No. 6.